So can you tell me a little bit about yourself, your name and where you live and work?
I'm John Franklin. I work in Macquarie University, or at least historically that's the case, and I still do. I still teach here, I still research here. But I set up a company called Growth Metrics about 4 years ago. I actually resigned from Macquarie University, basically to get away from the administration and stuff, and so that I could focus on the things that I thought were particularly important. And then I renegotiated my contract here, so I continue to supervise, to do research, to contribute to a number of programs, including the clinical program, which I was director of for 12 years.
Yeah, yeah. And so what do you do today?
You mean in my life now?
Yeah, yeah.
It's a mix of things, really. It's a mix of all of those things. I see myself principally as, I suppose, a researcher who is attempting to develop new levels of understanding and methods to help people live better lives.
Yeah.
So I'm reasonably well off financially, so the money that this produces isn't that critical to me, but I don't mind being rich. I don't mind being better off, but that's not my principal drive. My principal drive is, I think, to do something of value, to contribute something.
Yeah.
And so whilst I have a coaching practice, and whilst I have continue with a clinical practice, which is mostly coaching, and whilst I have a business, my principal interest really is developing new models and translating that into useful action.
Right. And what's your background for that?
I've got a Master's in Clinical Psychology, which I got from Flinders University in South Australia, and a PhD from the University of New South Wales, though I worked for a number of years in the United Kingdom.
Yeah, yeah. And how did you get into coaching?
I've always been interested in sort of meta questions, larger questions. I've never really been interested in sort of the small detail, though to some extent one has to. But it's always in the service of the bigger ideas. And my general view was always that I thought clinical psychology was way too narrow. Clinical psychologists and most therapists have too small a view of their enterprise, what it is they can do and should do. You know, it seemed to me that, and I had this view all along, that what we're really there to do is to help people live better, fuller, more complete lives. Yeah. And there was something missing. And so I've always had a sort of a positive orientation, and I've always been interested in organisational issues, which is why I've also taught on organisational psychology for 30 years as well. So I think organisations are important because, like families and like cultures, there's enormous resources and enormous capacity to influence people for good and bad. Yeah. And so that's my background. It's a sort of a mixture of lots of different things. But I was never happy just being a clinical psychologist. It was way too narrow a view. And so what changed things? It's hard to know. I mean, certainly reading the positive psychology stuff was exciting because that is an umbrella term. It brings stuff together, it integrates things, it gives a sort of coherence to it, which is, it's easier to have a conversation around a name or a title than just fragments of disconnected research. Of course, there's been many things that we now call positive psychology. You go back for 30, 40 years. But you know, I think Seligman was a bit vain in the early stages for not recognising that, but he's a little more modest now, a little more humble. I think someone tapped him on the shoulder and said, I think you may have overlooked some fairly important historic figures, Martin. You're not the only person in this world who's done this work, you know. So, you know, it's hard to know sometimes why we turn corners and what produces the change. But there was always a sense of insufficiency and dissatisfaction with conventional psychology.
Yeah. And how does positive psychology fit into your work today?
Well, I'm not even sure that I think it does in a way. I mean, my personal view is that I think what we're out to do is to help people live lives of meaning, purpose, fulfillment, satisfaction. Now, of course, positive psychology in a sense is the closest thing to that. In that, I think it's essentially about those things. It's about... Positive psychology is a sort of a new take on an old idea, which is self-actualization. About people being their best. Yeah. You know, the sort of stuff that Abraham Maslow's talked about, and you know, many other people through the years, Valiant and others have talked about. You can find many people throughout history who have done that. So positive psychology is, I think, a good umbrella term. But I don't divide the world up into positive psychology and organisational psychology and clinical psychology. Those are just sort of convenient institutional titles. You know, there's just sort of knowledge and research and understanding. Yeah. And in a simple sense, mean, it's hard to convey complexity in simple ideas, but my basic view is that what I actually want to do is to help people learn to live wisely. And the reason I think that's important is because I think the development of wisdom is one's greatest friend.
Yeah.
You know, I think in the end, happiness and life satisfaction is a consequence of how well we understand what's happening to us in our world, and that we use that to take effective action to improve things.
Yeah.
So I actually think that wisdom is a sort of a core outcome, a core pathway. It's an integrating pathway to living well and feeling good.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And the people that you help, the people that you coach or teach, what challenges do they come with? Do they present?
Well, first of all, I'm a clinical psychologist historically, so I still continue to see people. For example, I see drug addicts as well, you know, but I tend to treat them in an integrated way where I use as much positive psychology as possible.
Right.
But my core business is basically corporate psychology. It's dealing with people who have a whole variety of sort of problems. For example, I coach a guy who's a founder of an organisation. That's why he's got on his card, founder. Now, he's a guy who's got lots of big ideas, and he's a very visionary guy, but he's very autocratic.
Right.
And his management style is really problematic. So his interpersonal skills are really poor, even though he's got a great idea. At a conceptual level he's fine, but he can't translate that very well. I coach a guy who's a CEO in Singapore, and we do that via Skype. And that's really about leadership stuff, whatever he needs to do. I coach another guy who's a CEO here, someone else who's a senior partner in a law firm, those sorts of people. And so what's the content? I've developed a particular framework which is different from organisational and positive psychology, so would it be useful if I sort of explain that? Seligman has the PERMA model. I think it's inadequate for a number of reasons. It's not that I deny those things are important, there's clear evidence they are. It's just that I don't think they make sense. I don't think they make sense in a developmental sense. They don't fit together. So I think that basically what people do in life is that in order to, principally in the end, I think people want to feel good about themselves in their life. Yeah. It's an affective reaction. They want to just feel good. They want to maximise the feeling good, and they want to feel responsible for that. So the idea from 1984 of Soma, where people can be given a drug and they just feel good, but they actually don't do anything to contribute to that, isn't actually fulfilling for people. If people want to feel that they've created this beneficial outcome, they want to feel responsible for that or in control. So that's the outcome. And I think that comes essentially from meeting people's basic needs. And I think there's a long tradition in psychology of trying to figure out what those basic needs are. Maslow and many others, Murray and those sorts of things. I've got a different take on it. I think that there are 4 basic needs that people have. And the first is to feel content with themselves and the circumstances of their life. Yeah. Circumstances is really sort of quality of life stuff. Second is to feel connected. So to feel understood, appreciated, valued, on good terms with people. It doesn't have to be sexual, it doesn't have to be romantic, but people need to feel some connection. Yeah. Not alienation, not loneliness. Yeah. And then I think people need to feel that they're actually contributing something. They're actually doing something useful with their life. They're part of something bigger. Yeah. And we do that through our work, perhaps through our synagogue, through our religious institutions, community institutions, through our children, you know, our community, things like that. Yeah. But over and above that, there's a 4th thing, which is growth. In other words, I don't think it's good enough for people to just feel content, connected, and contributing. I think if you feel your life stagnant, then people don't feel happy. Humans have big brains, and the consequence of having a big brain is that we're not sort of happy to leave things as they are. We want to do stuff with it. We want to create. Yeah. And I think humans are essentially creative, and self-actualization is around that. I think everyone has a built-in need to develop themselves and improve their world. Yeah. And so my view about this is that these 4 needs are actually in a hierarchy, and growth is the bottom bit. And that, I think, is what coaching is about. In fact, I think all personal change and transformation is about that. It's about how do we grow so that we can become content, connected, and contribute. Yeah. And to the extent that we meet those needs and we feel that we are growing, content, connected, contributing, then we feel good, that enhances our well-being. So there's all sorts of other things like vitality and resilience that come out of that.
Yeah.
And that in turn helps us be successful in terms of external things like getting the jobs that we want, the house, the happy trophy wife, and all that sort of stuff. With the gleaming chrome teeth and everything. So why am I saying this? It's because I actually work from this framework, and it's an integrated framework, because essentially it flows upwards. It says that each of these things relate principally upwards, so that in order to contribute, it's very hard to contribute if we can't work with people.
Yeah.
So there's a set of skills in each of these things. People skills enable us to connect.
Yeah.
Since almost everything of value requires that we work with and through people, then it's hard to contribute in isolation.
Yeah.
So those contribution skills, those skills are dependent upon people skills. But our relationships with others are dependent upon our personal skills, that is, whether we like ourselves.
Yeah.
And so there's a set of personal skills as well. And below that is a set of learning skills. And so I think that the most important thing for people to learn in life and in coaching is how to benefit from experience.
Yeah.
You know, if there's one thing that makes a difference to people's lives in the end, it's the extent to which they've learned how to benefit from experience. So I see coaching as essentially learning to learn.
Yeah.
It's capitalizing on past experience, making the most of the new experience that you create so that you can learn to live well. And to do that, we need to develop a set of learning skills, personal skills, people skills, and contribution skills.
Yeah.
And so that's the framework with which I operate, by and large. And so I've developed an assessment measure around that, which is called the Human Capital Scorecard. And there's another one we're working on at the moment, which is called the Pathways to Happiness Scale.
Yeah.
The first one, the Human Capital Scorecard, is really in industry. It's an organisational scale. You can find it on my website, or there's reference to it. If you just go to growthmetrics.com, you'll see reference to it there.
Yeah.
So why am I saying this? It's because what I've done is I've effectively, I think, tried to integrate other findings, whether they be from social psychology, clinical psychology, positive psychology, into this framework. Essentially, because if you look at, say, I know I'm talking a lot, but I think it's important to get the sort of basic framework.
Yeah.
If you take a look at personal skills, which is what most coaching works on, I think there's a hierarchy there. It starts with self-compassion, then goes to self-regulation, self-efficacy, and then self-esteem. And there's a set of skills associated with each of those things, and there's a set of positive psychology interventions that contribute to each of those things. But it starts fundamentally with self-compassion. And even something below that, which is often mentioned but comes from Rogers, which is conditions of positive self-regard. How do we think we need to be in the world in order to feel okay about ourselves?
Yeah.
So what I've tried to do is, rather than be just a technician doing a lot of stuff and just doing techniques, I've tried to create a framework of understanding so that we can identify how people are doing with respect to these things, what are the skills that they need, and what are the techniques that both theory and evidence suggests are most effective in building each of these skills.
Yeah.
So that's a long answer to a simple question.
Oh, that's good. Very interesting. So what does it look like when you meet the client for the first time, or before you actually meet the client?
I always talk to the client the first time. And just to make sure that it's a sort of a fit and that there's a clear understanding about what we're going to do and why, and reassure them about the confidentiality aspects and all those sorts of things. And then I send them a set of questions ahead of time. They're not questionnaires, it's a set of questions, but sometimes there are some questionnaires in there as well. And they're essentially about helping them identify what it is that they want. What do they see as the good things in their life and the things they would like to improve? What they see as their strengths and what they see as their weaknesses, and a variety of other sorts of things like that. And the reason for that is to try to shape that first conversation so that people understand when they come in that these are the sort of things that we're talking about. And often people are inarticulate at first because they haven't had time to think about it.
Right.
And even though coaching sessions tend to last longer than clinical sessions, often the first one my normal ones go for about 90 to 120 minutes for the first session and much shorter thereafter, whereas clinical sessions tend to last just an hour. If we sort of frame that within an overall understanding, then that helps us develop a relationship and an agreement about what we're going to do and why.
Yeah. And how long time would it take for a client to kind of answer those questions?
I send them to them a week or so before, and I ask them to discuss it with their important people in their lives, like their life partner. How long they could answer them in 5 minutes. Most people say they've spent an hour or two thinking about it and coming back to it.
Right. And do they send you the answers before the session?
I ask them to fax it to me beforehand, or email it, or send it to me. But if they don't, they just turn up. It's basically just to sort of feed the conversation.
Right. And what then happens in the first session?
Well, like any relationship, it's about establishing a relationship. And so it's about being understood and being appreciated and developing respect and helping people feel heard, giving them a voice, making them understand, helping them understand that this is a confidential situation, that only under the most extreme circumstances is that breached, and they need to know what they might be. And that's important because most of my coaching engagements are paid for by somebody else.
Yeah.
And so they might think, well, the primary client is actually the one who pays, as opposed to the person who is actually present.
Yeah.
And so reporting is discussed. And then once that's out of the way, I ask them, do they need to know something about me? And then I normally zoom out and say, look, this can be about lots of things. Sometimes the agenda is sort of influenced or predetermined because they're there for a reason.
Yeah.
But I generally say, look, what this is really about is just you living a good life. It's about you finding a life which is truly satisfying and fulfilling for you. And whether you stay or leave in the firm doesn't concern me in a sense. That's your decision. It doesn't necessarily imply that you've got to stay in the firm. If you decide as a result of this you'd actually better place somewhere else or doing a different sort of work, that's a good outcome. My job isn't to sort of make things better for the firm, it's to people who are functioning well contribute better to the organisation.
Yeah.
So productivity and the organisation is enhanced by people who are doing well. My job is to help you be your best.
Right. And what then happens in the session?
So I then start really zeroing in on the things of concern to them. So I start by saying, first of all, tell me about the things that are going well in your life. And that's a very positive psychology thing, It opens people up, all the stuff about positive affect, and we all know from Fredrickson's and others' research what that does. But also because I don't want it to be a negative conversation, and also because there's so much evidence that what one needs to do is to widen the focus and start with the good stuff first. And so I want them to feel appreciated, and I don't want it to be a pathological conversation. And then I move to say, okay, so those are your qualities, those are the things you do well. What are the things you perhaps don't do so well? Are there sort of rocks on the road of life that you keep on tripping over? Are there any personal issues for you that you think actually inhibit you, or it's like trying to sail a boat with the anchor out, or trying to drive the car with the handbrake on?
Yeah.
Are there things there that it would be useful for you to perhaps pay attention to? Because I actually don't agree with this aspect of positive psychology, which overemphasises strengths. I think it's a bad mistake. Whilst I think there's a tradition of underappreciating strengths, and thus appreciation is necessary, to do that and neglect weaknesses, I think is a fundamental mistake.
Yeah.
Because in my experience, and I suspect it's true for you, we know many people who, it doesn't matter how well they use their strengths, unless they correct some fairly fatal weaknesses, they're never going to get on in life. And this founder, for example, is in a similar sort of situation. There are certain issues that this particular guy has, and that unless he addresses those, it doesn't matter how good he is in everything else. He's had a series of failed companies, and they always fail for the same reason.
Yeah.
So unless he addresses that and recognises that these things are fundamental to him being able to develop and utilise his other strengths, then he's never really going to get as far as he wants and can go.
Mm-hmm. And what happens after that in typical conversation?
We go wherever it's important to go. But essentially it's about helping him understand, or us develop a shared understanding of why these things are happening.
Yeah.
And what, in the end, I say, look, coaching is a bit like going to an architect. You go to an architect not to draw a house, but to build a house. So the point of what we do today is to, and each day we meet, is to come to a better understanding about you and your life and to find something useful to do. And at the end of the day, the value of that is expressed in what you do with it. So almost all the benefit of these sessions is in terms of the actions that you take afterward. All we're here to do is to do the planning. I'm a consultant to help you make sense of your life and figure some better ways of living. Your job is to use those and to learn from those, and then we come back. And so there's a set of exercises and reports that I would recommend that you do, because almost all of the work, but I don't think you'll experience it as work. I think you'll experience it as excitement and joy and pleasure. But all the things you do, that's where the real benefit comes from. Our job is to just try to make sense of that and learn from that and figure out what to do differently and better.
Right. And so in this session, how do you know what to talk about? Like, do you follow a process or a structure?
It's easy. It's easy. You just listen and follow. So there's two things really. One is listening really closely to what the person is saying and sometimes not saying. But the other is to be guided by an overall framework about what's important and what science tells us is significant. That's why I think an overall framework of understanding is critical. And frankly, where I think, I still think positive psychology falls down, because I think the PERMA model or Carol Riff's model or these other models are sort of partly there, but they're not, it's not enough. I think our greatest friend is theory.
Yeah.
You know, all of us are faced with trying to make sense of a complex and overwhelmingly difficult world, and we all need frameworks of understanding. That's why I explained right off first the framework of understanding.
Yeah.
And one of the conversations I often have with people in the first session, because it naturally emerges, is a question around, do you understand what makes you happy? Do you understand what a good life involves? And most people don't. So then I normally talk to them about the model I just talked to you about and what's composed of that, and indicate what the connection between that and performance and happiness and well-being and the rest of our life is, as a sort of a framework of understanding and discussion.
Yeah.
Now, I use a variety of other sorts of frameworks too, and I normally give people models. So I said earlier on that I normally sketch these things up. I always give people handouts,
Yeah.
readings, recommend they read a book. I always give them a journal, you know, so an empty book, and say, this is your personal record of what happens here. Treat this course, just imagine that what you've actually signed up for is a course in personal development. Treat it like a university course. Like any other course in your life, you know, it's not just a matter of turning up, you know, it's a matter of thinking, it's a matter of taking action, it's a matter of writing stuff down, it's a matter of reading. There's going to be a textbook, but it'll be principally your responsibility to do the learning and to derive benefit from this.
Yeah.
But get actively involved. It's the active involvement that makes a difference. Passivity, you'll get virtually nothing out of it.
Yeah.
And so I talk then about this sort of framework, and one of the other model I often give them is a model of how people work. I can give you a copy of this if you want.
Yeah, I'd like to see.
But it's really useful, because what it basically says is these are the things that we need to do. This is how people change. Because part of this model is I actually have a coaching model, which is called PAL, which is preparation, action, adaptive learning.
Yeah.
And my basic idea here is that people are happy and successful in their lives to the extent that they learn to learn. And so the whole point about this is to prepare people to take action from which they learn to live adaptively and happily.
Yeah.
So by developing wisdom, which is effectively just, I mean, it's not a highfalutin thing, wisdom. Wisdom is just understanding that leads to useful action.
Yeah.
And so there can be little wisdom and big wisdom, but you know, wisdom is what we're all gaining as we go through life. It isn't something that old people do. Wisdom is something that all of us do as we grow to appreciate how to live our lives more effectively.
Yeah. You said using theory as your friend. So how do you use theory? How does that inform your
All
work?
of those things. I mean, you know, just the basic understanding of what a good life is, basic understanding of what makes people feel good. You know, positive psychology has been a significant contributor to that. So I'll normally give them books or recommend. I normally actually have a series of loan books, and I put them on the table and say, have a look through these. What do you think would be most useful to you? And probably the most common one I use is The How of Happiness, I guess.
Yeah.
But there's, I think it's Aaron's book on Positiv. Positive Advantage.
Yeah.
In organisations, I mostly give people a copy of that book.
Yeah, yeah.
Because it's a really, he was at Harvard, it's a really, really good distillation of 7 basic ideas from positive psychology and how they can be used in an organisational setting.
Right.
So, you know, I tend to treat it, because I suppose I have an educational background, as our job is to help people learn better. And people learn better by being actively involved. But of course they only get actively involved when they see there's some personal benefit.
Yeah.
So after that, I then go back to, because this is part of the Powell thing. The very first, there's 3 questions in Powell. One is, why do you want to do this? I mean, what's the point of this? Because if they don't answer the why question, they're not engaged. They're not on board. They might feel duress, they may feel pressure, obligation to show up. Not going to do anything. You know? So until they know why they're here and why they're committed and what the benefits are, as well as what the cost, but they see the benefits as greater than the costs, they're not going to do anything else. Next question is, so what do we need to do? And that involves an understanding of how people work and what they need to change. And the last question is how. And I think many therapists and many coaches tend to concentrate way too much on the how of change, rather than what needs to change and the why of change. And I think that sequence is really important. So in that first conversation, I always talk about, so why are you doing this? I mean, why are you here? Are you here because you were told to be here? And if you're told to be here, are you just going to sit through this? Are you just going to suffer this? Or are you going to gain from this? What do you really want out of this, you know? If this could really change your life, just imagine that if in 6 or 8 or 12 sessions, you went home and you said, this has been transformative. You know, I see my life and my future in an utterly different way. This has been the most significant, or one of the most significant events in my life. What do you think we would do? What do you think you would do in order to get that? To make that happen.
And what happens after the first session, between the first and the second session?
Well, I take a sort of a Buddhist view about this, which is that I think that, and you'll see it, there's a linkage here. I think the biggest enemy of, the biggest problem we have is ignorance in life. And the answer to ignorance is understanding. And I don't mean ignorance in a sort of insulting way, but I think we're all born ignorant, that is, we just don't know. And none of us know very much, but the more we know, the more useful it is to us, hopefully, and probably the better the decisions, the better our life. So our job is to figure out what's going on. And so normally at the end of that, towards the end of the session, it becomes apparent that there are things we don't know much about, but we need to know. And so generally the first session ends with, so what would it be useful to find out more about? That could be anything. Just depends upon the person's particular needs, you know, and so then that framework or any other framework, it points to there are some deficits, there are some things that we don't know. So I often give people a variety of exercises. It might be self-monitoring exercises. Often it has to do with just waking people up to the connection between events, their cognitions and their feelings. Because men in particular are not very good at this. And so just recording those sorts of things. Filling out some questionnaires and often talking to their wife about it or their partners about it is actually quite important. But really identifying the things that are critical. Because in the end what I say is, look, we're not going to have time to do everything here. We may only have time to do one thing here. Hopefully we'll have time to do 3 things here. So our job is to try to figure out what is the smallest change we can make which will produce the biggest benefit. We're looking for a lever. So almost anything we do would be useful, but we're not just looking to do anything. We're looking to do the best thing. So what's the best thing that we could do? So I get people to try to identify the sorts of goals. What's the end objective, and then break that down into goals. And then try to figure out what we need to know about those things in order to go forward.
And then what happens in the second session?
It's a review. What have we learned? What have you done? What have you learned? What does that tell you? How does that fit in? So it's about, I come from a clinical background about building a formulation, but it's the same thing really. What we're trying to do is we're trying to build an understanding of their person and their life. So people need to understand who they are, how they got to be this way, how it influences what happens in their life, and how they need to change on the inside in order for the outside of their life to be pleasing to them. So it's really about it's always bringing it back. So what does that mean? How does that fit? What does that tell us about? So how does that integrate with other stuff? Where does that go? So what does that mean about this? So we're always trying to build an understanding of the person, because in the end, we're not going to be there. We're a ship in the night. We see them for a few hours in their life. But we can influence their life if what we help them do is to build a clear understanding of themselves and how they operate, so that they can take better decisions, better actions, for better outcomes.
Right. And how does the coaching engagement end at the last session?
How does the last one end?
Yeah.
Well, it depends upon what determines the end point. If it's paid for by an organisation, sometimes they just contract for a certain number of sessions, in which case we work for that, and that's a sort of a known thing. It's going to be 8 sessions. Sometimes it just comes to an end, or we work in phases because we're working in particular areas.
Right.
But I have 2 views about this. One is that there's a sort of an alternate objective, which is what you hope to achieve by the end of the X number of sessions. But then there's an objective within each session. So every session has got to have a benefit.
Yeah.
And they add together to contribute to that end objective. So even if the person never comes back, or there's a single session, I always treat them as a set of single sessions, as if I assume that this person may never come back. So how can we make this a really, really worthwhile and valuable encounter?
Right.
If we've only got an hour or 90 minutes, what's the most valuable thing that we can do in this time, just in case we never meet again?
Yeah.
So the person might look back and say, that was time really well spent.
Right.
So that we always come down to some action.
Yeah.
And some personal responsibility and some ongoing things. So I always say in the end, so what does that mean? How can you use that? When's the next opportunity you could use that? How would things be different if you were to do that?
Right.
And we often role play those so as to make those applications easier.
And can you tell me about the role play? What would
Well, it depends upon what the issues are. For example, the CEO I'm coaching at the moment has difficulties with a couple of his members of staff, and so there's certain areas he has particular difficulty with, so we rehearse what that's going to be and work out a sort of structure and framework, try to give him a language and some key ideas and some phrases, and then we just role play and say, okay, I'm that person. Let's do it now. Show me how you're going to actually do that. And then we go through it, and then we talk about it, and then we do it again.
Right.
Because I think that people are much more likely to do something and do it well if they've already done it before.
Yeah. And you mentioned several times. You mentioned assessments. Can you say something more about your thoughts on assessments?
Well, I mostly use my own assessment, which is the Human Capital Scorecard.
Yeah.
But I also use a variety of these things, and so rather than go through them now, it's in these 2 handouts.
Yeah.
Most of these things, but I mostly use Positiv psychology things. But there's a variety of stuff. This one here, setting the coaching agenda, or Jarden stuff.
Yeah.
It's full of those sorts of things. But things like the Warwick Edinburgh Mental Wellbeing Scale is an excellent scale.
Yeah.
And I use that all the time. The World Health Organization, the WHO 5. There's many things, resilience scales, those sorts of things. But the point about them really is twofold. One, and the principal thing, is because good questionnaires are really like a good conversation. They're a set of really well-chosen questions to reflect on.
Yeah.
And so when I ask people to fill them in, I say, don't just fill it in, think about it. Think about these questions and what they mean, because I'd like to talk to you about what that meant to you.
Right.
How did it change your thinking about those things? And often prompts conversations. This is amusing. When I did my PhD, we had, which was on the nature of panic disorder and agoraphobia. Everyone had to fill out these questionnaires at the start, and the treatment started later. And then I was interviewing people, and people came back and they were saying, this treatment is really good, it's really working for me. And it hadn't started. It hadn't started. And I got alarmed. I thought, what do you mean? And they said, well, those questionnaires you've been filling out, they're really, really useful. It's caused me to really think about my life, and I've started talking to my children about some of those ideas, and I've been talking to my wife, and I can see that things are really starting to change for me. Hasn't begun. But it has actually.
Yeah.
It has, because assessment is reactive.
Yeah.
Good assessment provokes people to think about important issues in their lives.
Yeah. It's and normally I used to work for SHL, and our instruction to the clients were, don't think too much about the questions, just fill out, you know, first thought. And your instruction is almost opposite.
Well, I often say that at the beginning, just fill it out, but at the end, go back and reflect on that.
Okay.
And with these important questions for you, because I think often the quick answers are the best answers.
Right.
But go back again and read through those and think about, are these issues in your life? Is this important? Why am I asking you to do this? Where does this fit?
Right.
If you were better at this, what would it mean? Have there been occasions when you've been better at it?
Yeah.
How could you be better at those sorts of things? Are they significant, or are we wasting our time here?
Right. And when do you switch up into assessments?
I can't tell you. It depends entirely upon the particular individual's needs. But so I said there's two reasons. One is to facilitate a discussion and an appreciation of what's going on. Because I think one of the biggest problems for people, you're familiar with the term alexithymia?
I've heard it before.
No words for emotion.
Yeah.
Now, Todd Kashdan was talking about that at the conference. I don't know if you heard his paper, but he was basically saying clarity around emotions mediates outcome. Actually, the literature doesn't quite support him on that. It says it's not just clarity, it's the ability to actually do something with that knowledge that really mediates it. So if you only have clarity, it seems that being aware of internal stuff can make you worse if you can't change it.
Right.
It's a bit like social phobia. If you direct people's attention to what's going on inside, often it makes them worse.
Yeah.
They get preoccupied with internal states rather than what's happening outside. It's the capacity to do something that really mediates that change.
Right.
I've lost my train of thought.
So what I really wanted to know was how do you choose between these assessments?
Oh, because what we're trying to do here is to help people develop a language for conversation.
Right.
So I think our ability to change our life is related to our ability to think about our life. And that is dependent upon us having a language to describe our life.
Yeah.
And these measures help amplify that for people.
Right.
It helps create a more nuanced, detailed, complex understanding of the way they work and what is actually happening in their life. And that, I think, is the principal reason for doing it. The other, of course, is repeated measures so as to determine whether or not they're improving.
Right.
Now, that's critical, but things won't change unless people, first of all, can make sense of their life, and they need a language of description to do that.
Right. And so just to make sure I understand it correctly, so you would have one or several conversations with a person, you'll find out what topic's important, and then you'll choose an assessment that the person will fill out in the session or between sessions?
There's always assessments. So people are always doing assessments, of one form or another, even if it's just sort of self-report sort of stuff in various ways. So it's the idea that no one really understands what's going on, but to the extent that we do, it helps.
Right.
So if we understand a little, well, we can do a little. If we understand more, we can do more.
Yeah.
Our job is to build our understanding, and that just grows all the time. So our job is to make sense of of your life, assuming you're the client. How do we do that? We do a whole lot of stuff, all of which is designed to promote understanding. I see understanding and learning as the golden pathway to improvement and change and a better life.
Yeah.
So how do we do that? We first of all have to pay attention. We have to notice things. So that's why I use meditation, mindfulness, and these other things, because it helps people to notice, pay attention, to observe things about themselves and their life.
And practically, so if I wanted to build my resilience and you would give me a resilience questionnaire or something like that, would I fill it out at home or in the session?
Preferably at home.
At home?
I try to encourage people to do as much work out of the session as possible, because our job is to make sense of what you've done.
Right.
So this is a sort of a guided conversation, guided by framework, theory, evidence, about what might be useful to the person.
Right.
And time is precious. Coaching tends to have longer sessions, but it has fewer sessions than, by and large, partly because you charge quite a lot for coaching.
Yeah.
I mean, my rates make it expensive and difficult for people, though they pay it. And I have to say most of my clients actually pay for themselves. But that means that there's a premium upon the utility, the value that people extract from that time.
Yeah.
That is important for them. So I try, wherever possible, to encourage people to do things at home, and they like that. So frequently email them, send them stuff, that sort of stuff. They email stuff back to me.
Right. And what about interventions? Which interventions do you use, and how do you use them?
Well, I don't sort of consciously use standard positive psychology interventions, actually. It depends upon what person's needs are. So let's take an example. Let's take the bottom layer of learning.
Yeah.
I think there's 5 parts to this. The first is certain basic attitudes to learning. So, for example, if you take the view that you can't change, or that you're not responsible for change, then that is going to be a real impediment to anything else that happens. If you feel that you don't have any control over your world, that others control you, these are really fundamental ideas. If you feel that your talents are fixed, this will be really limiting factors. So the first place, in a way, is to get those basic ideas in place, basic beliefs, and if they don't believe them, then they become something that we explore to see whether they can be true. So the first thing is beliefs. The second thing is openness, which is one of the big 5. Curiosity, your strength. So what we try to do is to encourage people to notice. So I often say to people, never pick a fight with reality, because if there's one fight you'll always lose, it's that. The only safeguard is delusion, but that's not going to serve you very well for very long. In the end, our life, things go well for us to the extent that we are in touch with reality, and most of us are not. So our job then is to start noticing, to start paying attention. So that's what all these assessments are about, really. It's opening us up. It's about learning, finding out what's going on. The next thing is motivation. Lots of motivational theories. But I think there are these 4 basic needs that people have, but there are a lot of other needs that people have over and above that. And we have those needs. We also, in the end, are driven by our values. And so values clarification is really, really important. So the reason I'm saying this is because there's a sequence, you see. So I normally start and work through the sequence. Do you have the sort of beliefs that will enable you to grow? If you don't, nothing else is going to happen. Are you open so that you will gain new knowledge? If you're not open, nothing much is going to happen. And then, what do you want to have happen? That's a values question as much as anything, or a needs question. We all have the same needs, we don't have the same values. Being clear about satisfying our universal needs as well as our individual values is very important. That drives motivation. The next bit is, well, how can we make that happen? If this is how you want your life to be, how can that happen? And there's 2 bits to that. The first is proactivity. You've got to take action. Don't wait for others. You have to do something. Stop avoiding, get going. That's why in the PAL system it's the preparation, action, and then you learn. And the second part of that learning, well, the first part is proactivity. The second is problem solving or pathways. So it's a matter of developing pathways to understanding and learning. So I go through this sequence, and what we do in terms of assessment or positive psychology interventions relates to each of those things. There's things about the beliefs, there's things about becoming open, mindfulness, lots of other sorts of things, these exercises. There's things, value exercises, values clarification exercises that are important there, needs identification, those sorts of things. And then proactivity about the role of avoidance and confrontation and seeing opportunities. And then there's finding solutions. So what I do is based upon those things. So coaching always starts with those things. Until those things are in place, until people have a process, a means of learning and improvement, they are not properly prepared to work on the other stuff. So let's say you are the client and you've got interpersonal problems and there's difficulty at work, I wouldn't normally start there. Because I normally take the view that you have to learn the skills to be effective. So we have to learn the learning skills. And then the question is, are your interpersonal problems really just an expression of personal issues? So I'd want to check that the layer below, which is self-compassion, self-regulation, self-efficacy, self-esteem is in place. Because if you don't feel well about yourself, if you don't feel good about yourself, if you don't feel you can manage your life effectively, if your emotions are all over the place, and if you're not kind to yourself, how can you be kind and compassionate to others? You'll never have a better relationship with others than you have with yourself. So the idea is we work up through these things. And so, you know, we start at the bottom and we just work our way up. Now, some people have got the learning stuff off pat, that's no problem.
Right.
And so we just check out the necessary skills and then start at the lowest level, which is necessary to facilitate the upper skills, those sorts of things, so that they flow upwards.
And is that happening in the first session when you follow the sequence, or?
Well, it's in my head the whole time.
Right.
So I think good coaches and good therapists are people who have they don't have the answer, but they have a methodology, they have a process which help people make sense of their life and clarify what is happening so they can take effective action.
Right, yeah.
That's why I say theory is our best friend.
Yeah.
You know, that we need to be able to think about, conceptualize the complexity and confusion and distress in people's lives so that we can see what comes first. And otherwise we just do things.
Yeah.
But I think some things are more important than others. And we don't have time to do many things. So what are the most important things? The most important thing, I think, is first of all to just understand the problem.
Yeah.
Understand the how. Why are we doing it? What needs to change? And then how are we going to change that?
Yeah.
And, you know, it's better to do the most important things, one important thing, than to do a whole pile of other things that are unimportant.
Yeah.
It's like doing what's important rather than just being busy.
Yeah.
Identifying what's important is, I think, a key skill in coaching.
Yeah. Let's see. Can you say something about the active involvement? You mentioned that a couple of times.
Well, I explain to people because I think people need to understand the process, and part of the process is, look, this is us working together. That's why I mostly don't sit opposite people. I sit next to them at a desk.
Yeah.
Like we're working together on an enterprise with a whiteboard, and we often hop up and down and we write stuff on the whiteboard, or we write stuff down on a piece of paper. And the whole idea is people take notes. So for example, I say to people, I'd like you to bring your iPhone along and record the session. Because one of the things that I'd really like you to do, and I think you'll find benefit in, is going through the session again. And telling me what you've learned from the session, what was good and bad about the session. Because people remember very little.
Yeah.
You know, the forgetting curve, Eberhard's forgetting curve, which we should, if there's one thing we should remember, it's that we don't remember.
Yeah.
That we forget.
Yeah.
So how do we maximize the learning? How do we maximize the remembering?
Yeah.
If we lose almost everything, how can we maximize that? That's why I say take notes, write in the journal, use your iPhone, use your recorder.
Yeah.
You know, part of the learning is to going through that sort of thing. Squeeze the orange, get the most out of every session. There's not going to be many of these, so make sure you get the most out of them.
Yeah. What about knowledge sharing?
Well, my job, I think, is to help people make sense of their life and their world. And they can't do that on ignorance. That's why I say, look, treat it as a university course. So there's going to be readings, you know. There's going to be a book, maybe a few books. I'll be giving you articles and things like that, and I'll be encouraging you to do internet searches, doing that sort of stuff yourself. So coming to understand this is really, really important. But unless you have a guide through that, it can be very confusing because the world's got too much stuff to read.
Yeah.
So how can we distill that into useful things? That's why I have a set of resources that I give to people. Always hand them out these resources or key readings on self-compassion, for example, which is often a really important place to start because people are often very hard on themselves.
Yeah.
They drive themselves and they don't have a clear understanding of how they think they need to be in order to feel okay about themselves.
And what do you give them for self-compassion?
Christine Neff's stuff. She's written a pile of stuff on this, and she's written a new book on self-compassion. But I don't ask people to buy books by and large because that's expensive. I give them key general articles, sometimes research articles, depending upon their background and whether they'd have that sort of time and interest. But it's to sort of embed that idea. I often give them copies of the questionnaires to keep.
Right.
Because the questionnaire embodies the idea.
Yeah. What about flexibility? Adapting to clients' contexts?
Well, I think that's absolute and a given. That the good coach never does the same thing twice, but they have a general framework, I think, that guides them to be unique on every occasion. That's why I think it's actually quite hard to follow a good coach or a good therapist, because they never do the same thing twice. what they're doing is always governed by what what happened just a moment ago, what the person just said or didn't say.
Yeah.
And an emerging understanding. So I think that sort of ultimate flexibility is really important because people really feel heard, they really feel understood, they really feel listened to, and they feel this is a uniquely personal conversation about them and their needs and their life situation.
Yeah. And how do you know how to adapt? Like what to adapt?
I just think it's a life skill. I think that's what we do as we grow. To the extent that we make sense of ourselves and other people and we really listen and trust ourselves, then you just know. It's like the inner voice in a way. So I don't think about that by and large. It's an unconscious process. But sometimes many times there's choice.
Yeah.
As to people say things and there are many things you could say. So I tend then to fall back on a theory of the person or the theory of the problem or the theory of change to guide me as to what might be the most useful place to go. Because there's no right place, there's no one place, there's many places. So I try to find the thing which would be most helpful or most useful. Right. But that's a personal judgment. And if you were listening to what I was saying, you'd probably make different decisions at any moment to me. But that's because you're a different person, that's fine. It's not because I'm right or wrong or you're right or wrong. It's different people relating to each other in a way that helps the other person live better.
Right. And falling back on the theory of change, what theory of change do you use?
Well, the stages of change I think is a bit inadequate, which is why I developed my own, which I'm going to publish, and I'll send you a copy of it actually.
Oh yes, please.
But it's basically this idea that, and I've already said it really, it's about, there's 3 stages: the why, the what and the how. And the why is made up of 4 things. I don't know if you want me to go through those 4 things. The first is distress or dissatisfaction. The person needs to be distressed to a certain extent or unhappy or dissatisfied to a certain extent. Then the next thing is they need to have an objective. They need to have some clarity about where they're going. Yeah. And coaching psychology does that well. So what's the point of it? You know, if assuming this goes really well, where will we be? How will your life be different? How will we know that's the case? So then there's the objective. The next is desire. How important is this to you? If you have to give up something, and you almost certainly will, you'll have to stop doing things, some of which, work to an extent. How important is this to you in your life? What are going to be the benefits and advantages of this? And what do you anticipate will be the costs? Yeah. And are you sure this is going to benefit you more than it's going to cost you? Because if people think it's going to cost them more, they won't do it. They'll find ways of avoiding it, So it's desire, and I think we need to get good at building desire, which is a largely cost-benefit analysis. The next is barriers. So, you're dissatisfied, you know what you want, it's important to you, why aren't you doing it? Because there are barriers. Yeah. And then we need to identify what those barriers are. Yeah. And that first work about the why is important. And until those questions are answered, until the barriers are down, until people have a high level of desire, until they're clear about where they're going, and they're motivated to get something or reduce something, then they don't have a commitment to change. Mm. The next question after the why is, well, what do I need to do? And that's really an unpacking of their life and their unique circumstances, which is complex and always different, to identify what's most important to do. And the next question is, so how would we make that happen? Which is largely a technique question. Yeah. And, so I go through this with people and say, look, these are the 3 fundamental questions. Let's not bother ourselves about the how. Lots of people say, yeah, but, there's no point in me even dreaming something if I don't think it can be realised. To which I say, just assume it's possible. Yeah. Just assume. One way or another, we can make your life better. We can always make your life better. How far, how fast, who knows, doesn't matter. It's still worth doing. Anything that can improve your life is worth doing. So just trust that we can find a way. So assume that were possible, what is it that you would want?
And the expectations, like assuming that it is possible, can you say something about...
Well, the very first thing down the bottom of that thing is certain basic beliefs. Yeah. Internal locus of control, optimism, hope. These are really, really fundamental ideas, and personal responsibility. Really, really. Seeing life as a puzzle, for example. Yeah. seeing life as a challenge, seeing life as an adventure, these sort of metaphors for life. These are really, really important ideas, and creating positive expectations. So there's two things there. One, I suppose, is about whether or not people can change, and so giving them some evidence of that is important. But the other is they need to trust us.
Yeah.
Because, you know, there's a lot said about the coaching relationship, but I think the two most important things are trust and credibility.
Yeah.
So how do we get to be seen as trust and credible? We need to build that to start off with. So they need to see us as somebody who can actually help them, somebody that is really on their side. And you can do that in various ways. You can do it through qualifications, but just in terms of first impressions, reputation, of course, information that we send them, our professionalism,
Yeah.
The physical circumstances under which we see people like that. But I think people, even if they believe that they could change, they won't necessarily want to do it with us if they don't see that we're effective change agents.
Yeah.
That's why trust and credibility are really, really critical.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of other stuff that's talked about the coaching relationship, I don't think is that important. That's why I think you don't actually need to have a coach present. I think what really changes people is not the relationship at all, really. People engage with an idea. That's what I think is important. That's why I think e-coaching, whether it's on the internet or through a book, can be transformative as well.
Yeah.
So long as you trust the book or the idea,
right.
and you see it as credible. But if you don't trust it and you don't see it as credible, you won't use it.
Right.
So, you know, I don't think a person is necessary. I think it helps, because we all relate better to somebody else.
Yeah.
That's, you know, it's critical. But I don't think it's necessary for change.
Right.
What really is necessary for change is understanding. And you can learn to understand in many ways.
Yeah.
Your life has improved, not just by the people you met, but the ideas you came in contact with, and your own thinking and your own self-reflection.
Yeah.
And so it is in coaching. Coaching doesn't require people, but people help.
Right. And the relationship, so now when the person has chosen to see you as a coach and you're trying to establish and maintain a relationship, what do you do?
I try to treat them well. I try to respect them. I try to honour them. Try to make them feel valued and capable and intelligent and resourceful. Just treat them like you would treat any person who you respected. I don't think it's that complicated. You know, people who get into this industry, I don't actually talk about it as an industry, but I mean, you know, people who want to help others normally have a positive view about others and normally relate fairly well to others. And we sense that very quickly, you know. How long does it take you to sense whether you like somebody or whether this person is really listening to you?
A few seconds.
Exactly so. You make that judgment almost in a nanosecond, you know.
Yeah.
Just like you walk into a party, some people are going to be bad company, other people, this is going to be a great way to spend the night. I'm so pleased I met this person.
Yeah.
You can feel that with a therapist, you can feel that with a coach.
Yeah.
Same thing.
Yeah.
It's just basic human qualities. And, you know, I keep using the word respect, but it's also appreciation. Because in a way, I think caring for people is an act of loving. And I think the core aspect of loving is appreciation.
Yeah.
To see the good, to
Yeah.
see the potential, to see the things that are best about people. And also to see what they can be, not just who and what they are at this moment.
Yeah.
And if people sense that, if people feel that, then they by and large stay with you, I think.
Right.
So it's not something I consciously do. I just think whenever I try to do that with every person, not just a client. And I think if we do that well, then it just enhances everything else.
Right.
Because the biggest problem people have in life, other than ignorance, is that they think they feel inadequate and underappreciated.
Yeah.
So if we can appreciate them, which is an act of loving, then I think that is a very significant contribution to self-esteem.
Right. Yeah. The first time I came across some of your work was a book from 2005 based on a conference from 2003 on client readiness for change.
Yeah.
And I have a question about, you've already mentioned, you know, involvement, that sort of stuff, but can you say something more about that?
Well, that stuff there is sort of a bit dated in a way. It's an older view I had about about it. But it was a question I was asking a decade ago about what is it that enables people to make lasting and significant change in their life. And I was just sort of getting together a list of things that differentiate, that characterise that. And I can give you, I've developed a 17-point scale for that, and I can give you readiness. There's a readiness for change scale, and one other thing that I often do is there's a booklet I've developed around that, which I normally send to people as well, which is called Making Change Happen.
Yeah.
And it basically just builds on these basic principles and gives examples, and it's trying to build an understanding of the process of change and their commitment to change. So I can give you that. I probably can't give it to you today. I can email it to you though.
Right.
But that my views have moved on to really this other view, which I explained to you a moment ago about, why, what, how, and unpacking that, because I think there's a sequence and a process to it. It isn't just a set of things that you tick that need to be present.
Right.
There's some things that are really primary, and unless people have a reason to change, they don't.
No.
They don't change just because someone tells them to go and sit and you can go and talk to that guy on 8 occasions for an hour.
What feedback do you get from your clients? What do they tell you helps them most?
What feedback do I solicit, or what do they just tell me?
Both.
Well, I use this coaching reflection sheet, which a lot of, in therapy it's often used, which is, think about relationships, what the relationship with the coach, goals and topics, approach and method overall, that sort of thing. But as you'll see, I've actually modified it. And I ask people to fill this in every second session or so. And so it's feedback about the relationship, but it's also about these positive things which contribute to overall outcomes. So I also ask them, how happy and optimistic do you feel? How calm and relaxed? How full of life? How resilient? How committed and motivated? How confident on this 0 to 10 scale? And also ask them to track how they're going with respect to their 3 goals.
Yeah.
So I do that on a regular basis. But I always ask them, is this helping? Is this useful?
Yeah.
Our job is to find the most useful thing to do. So tell me, please, this has got to work for you. It's critical at any point if you feel we're off task, going someplace that's irrelevant to you, just say it.
Yeah.
Just tell me, because this is, in the end, you are the ultimate measure of whether this is working.
Yeah. So
it's your satisfaction about whether we're on task or off task. Now sometimes we'll talk about stuff that you don't perhaps immediately see the connection to. So be a little tolerant here, if you can't immediately see it. But if after a while you just haven't got it, tell me, because that's a failing on my part that I haven't connected up the dots.
Yeah.
So I often say, life's like a jigsaw puzzle, and our job is to make sense of our life, and it's a 1,000,000-piece jigsaw puzzle or 1,000-piece, and we've only got a few pieces. Our job is to gather as many pieces as possible and start putting them together and orient them until we have these aha experiences where you think, I understand that bit, and I see how it connects to this bit.
Yeah.
And so you're building it, and at some point you say, it's Paris, it's the Eiffel Tower.
Yeah.
Or something, But our job is to go on gathering the pieces and to go on making sense and to seeing how this bit can help that bit.
Yeah.
What does this bit tell you about what's going to be lying around the edges, what we need to find over here?
Right. And you mentioned your 3 goals. What's 3 goals? Do you always set 3?
Well, because mostly I think in the sort of coaching that I do, which tends to be about 8 to 12 sessions, it's hard to achieve more than 3 goals. So I normally say, look, there's a difference between goals and objectives. The objective is the big picture, the ultimate picture. It's about how you really want your life to be. But the goals are the things that we are going to work on that's possible for us within the time it's available.
Right. Yeah.
So the second question, after why, it's what do we need to change?
Yeah.
Those are the goals in a sense.
Right.
And how do we change that? That's how we negotiate the goals. How do you translate the ultimate objective into the things we need to work on and achieve in order for that to facilitate the ultimate objective?
Yeah.
So it all flows back and upwards.
Right.
You can't have everything. Let's assume that, let's go for 3.
Yeah.
We may not be so lucky.
Mm.
But, we're sure as hell going to go for 1. If you can only have 1, what's the one thing which is most important to do in this session?
Yeah.
What's the one thing that will make the biggest difference to your life?
Right. And what do the clients tell you when they come back to you, like spontaneously, that has been most helpful to them?
I'm not sure what is most helpful. I can tell you that they find it helpful, but I'm not sure I know why. I mean, for example, the other day I was coaching this guy who's a senior partner, and he comes from a family that's a bit disaffected. You know, they're people who are a bit sour. You know, they have a particular take on life, and he doesn't have a very good relationship with his children. Anyway, he came back, and I started the session by saying, "So, what's happened?" And you know, he starts telling me. I said, "Tell me the good stuff first." You know, and he said, "Well, I'll tell you something that really shocked me." He said, "I went into town the other night. As you know, I've got I think it's a 16-year-old son, and he wanted to stay out late and go to the city. And normally, this produces a lot of tension between myself and him. And I said to him, "Oh, look, I'll come and pick you up, and bring you home just so as to make sure you're safe and you've had a good night." And the son said, "Thanks." He goes and picks him up, and on the way home, the son quite spontaneously turns to his dad and he says, "You know, because of I think it's because of the coaching, because he's been telling his family he's going to coaching. He says, because of your coaching, you're the dad I really always wanted to have."
That's nice.
Now, what makes that happen? I don't know. It's that people see that they're making progress towards the things that are truly important, that are really valued.
Yeah.
And that's a very personal thing. But what is it? I think that I have a particular view about this, which is that people are learning to do the things that meet their needs so that they can be happy and meet others' needs. And I think that there's four things, you know, that people need to feel that they are growing, developing as people, they're not stagnant, that people are feeling more content with themselves, they are feeling more connected to other people, and that they feel they're doing something useful in the world.
Yeah.
And to the extent that those things are present, then people are travelling better and they've got more energy and time for others. So if we think about who is most caring, who is most generous, who is kindest, it's the people who aren't preoccupied with themselves.
Yeah.
People are okay, they're at peace with themselves, they can accept themselves, warts and all. Doesn't mean they're content to leave it that way, they're complacent, but they accept where they are and they don't beat themselves up about that, because that's who humans are. Humans are always inadequate, humans are always suffering, humans are always striving, humans are always failing, but humans are always succeeding too.
Yeah.
And we just try to do the best we can.
Yeah.
And so it's the people who are not preoccupied with themselves who have most to give. And I think that's what the son was saying, because he then said to his son, "So what's different? What's changed?" And he said, "You seem to be much more interested in me and my life, and you listen much better, and you don't judge as much." Now, where does that come from?
Yeah. Maybe the relationship with you, if you treat him the same way?
Yes, but only a small part. In the end, it's that he realises that certain things are necessary. So when we talk about what are the skills that contribute to social relationships, you know, they start with compassion and having a social responsibility towards others, and then accepting other people in terms of the way they are, having positive expectations of other people, and social skills, and then social influence. You know, these are the sorts of things. So we help people then develop those particular skills, because to the extent that people have those ideas and they develop those skills, hopefully they'll get on better with others.
Yeah. And what would you say are some of the effective factors, the most important effective factors or causal mechanisms that cause the change when you see progress?
I'm not quite clear what you mean by that question, so I'll try answering and you tell me if I've got it wrong.
Yeah.
I think it's that people come to understand that there's a close connection between the way they think, feel and act,
yeah,
and what they experience and what happens for them in this world.
Yeah.
Now that's in a way a non-answer. It's a sort of a typical university type non-answer. But I do think it's a sort of a higher level conceptual thing that people need to really understand. They really need to know. They really need to become more aware of what's actually happening in them and how it causes them to behave in certain ways, even non-verbally. So for example, if we want to get on better, we're each transmitting information to each other, but you can't conceal who you are and what you really think and feel. And so if I have a certain attitude towards you, which is that, you know, I actually think Danes are pretty bloody awful people, because, you know, I was in Copenhagen and I got cheated by this Dane, you know, I'm still angry about it actually, and I'm not going to forgive you because you're a Dane too. And people have attitudes like this, you know, because their first primary experience. If you were treated badly by a black person, if you were treated badly by an older man, if you were treated badly by someone or other, it's hard not to be prejudiced.
Yeah.
These things come across. So helping people know those basic attitudes and changing those things is important. So I think that, in a way, it's all pretty simple. It's about people making sense of their world so that they can act wisely. That is in their own interests and that of others.
Yeah.
We're not in this world just to improve our life. In fact, we can't be happy, I think, in isolation. We can only be happy together.
Yeah.
You know, we're social animals.
Yeah.
And we are people who need to live in and with other people in harmony.
Yeah.
And we need to feel that we're doing something useful in this world. And our job, I think, as coaches, is to help people understand how they can live better. And so, you know, it comes back to that problem. If ignorance is the problem, understanding is the answer.
Yeah. So
But it's the action we take based upon understanding, because wisdom is not just understanding, it's the application of understanding. You're not wise if you know something and you don't use it.
No.
You're only wise when you use what you know.
Right. And so some people say that the relationship is, you know, a group of effective factors. Some people say that what goes on outside, maybe the client readiness, are effective factors. Some people say that techniques and models can have active ingredients. Some people say that expectations and allegiance to the way they work and stuff. So what do you think?
I think those things are small beer. I think they're all in the service of something more important, which is principally our job is to help people rethink their life. All of those things may encourage, but if the person doesn't rethink their life and learn to behave differently, it counts for nothing.
Right.
So these things are helpful, but in the end, our job is to help people think about their life differently so that they take some action from which they learn and ultimately benefit. And so all of those things are just about those things.
Oh, right.
That's why I always say, so what does this mean? You tell me, why are we doing this? What have you learnt from this? What's different now?
So just to make sure that I understand correctly, so these four things that you mentioned, everything else, all the other factors should contribute to these four things.
Right.
Okay.
And if those things, everything else is subordinate to that.
Yeah.
But if people don't rethink their life, they don't take effective action, if they don't learn and they don't embed it in habits of action, thinking and feeling, then their life won't really change. There's no point doing it once.
Right.
It's got to become habitual. It's got to be part of the way you think, feel and act.
Yeah.
You know, we all learn things at work and then we stop doing them. Well, that's pretty smart, isn't it?
Yeah.
Living well involves then becoming who we are.
Yeah.
Part of the way in which we operate automatically, just like driving. I'm sure you drive across town and you get there and you not even aware, you can't have no memory of the trip.
Mm.
But hopefully it didn't kill anyone.
No.
But it's automated. But
yeah.
you know, and life lived well is automated in that way. It's hard to think. So it's effortful and it's painful, and you can see why people don't want to do it and they feel insufficient to the task.
Yeah. And what do you do to develop as a professional?
Well, I see myself principally actually as a researcher actually. I think my job is to try to, lessen the ignorance, to try to make better sense of what's going on. Because I think that's the greatest service that one can do in the end. If we can provide people with frames of reference, frames of understanding, conceptual frameworks, I think that's the greatest contribution. Hopefully if there's some accuracy to it and people use it, then that's the real value. So for example, one of the studies we're doing at the moment is evaluating pathways to happiness. Yeah. So we're evaluating PERMA, and we're evaluating a variety of different methods like Carol Riff's approach, because to see how well they predict subjective well-being, happiness, vitality, a variety of other sorts of outcomes. Right. So to sort of test that basic model that I have in mind there. So, another thing I'm doing at the moment is what's called positive mood enhancement. We did a study 2 years ago where we were trying to predict what is it that actually best predicts success as well as well-being.
Yeah.
And traditionally what's happened in psychology is we've paid a lot of attention to self-regulation around negative mood states.
Yeah.
So, and most of resilience is about that. It's about bouncing back.
Yeah.
Now, we use the Positiv, which is sort of the gold standard in this area. And what we found is that in trying to predict well-being, I put together a simple little scale in 2 days, which is called the Positive Mood Enhancement Scale. It just had 14 items, actually less than that, items about how well people can manage to keep themselves in a good mood or put themselves in a good mood. It turned out that the Positive Mood Enhancement Scale was more powerful than the Connor-Davidson.
Okay.
In other words, it's at least equally important to learn to keep positive and get positive as it is to not get negative.
Yeah.
But we, and a lot of the stuff about positive psychology really contributes to producing positive emotions. So that's really, really important. So what we're doing is the study has 3 parts. It's developing this positive mood enhancement scale. It's about identifying strategies for positive mood enhancement, and then it's about testing those strategies to see to what extent they can be useful. Because it seems that the capacity to put ourselves and keep ourselves in a good mood is really critical. But most of the literature has been concentrating about how do we get ourselves out of the hole.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's a sort of an answer to your question, in a way. I actively research, I teach, I go to conferences, and I consider that all of coaching is really about transmission of that understanding applied to the unique circumstances of the individual.
Yeah.
And we have a peer coaching support network as well. I attend conferences, of course. Other sorts of stuff that most people do, I think.
And so when you learn something new, for instance, at a conference like the one in Wollongong, how do you take what you've learned and kind of start using it in your coaching?
Well, take Todd Cashman's stuff. Yeah, he's talking about clarity. I thought that's really interesting. That's really interesting. So I immediately went home and started reading up on that. The evidence doesn't support him, as it turns out. But and so that's useful. So now I'm chasing down some scales about this, and there's a German scale I'm actually trying to get hold of. I can give you the name of it in a minute, off camera. I don't have it before me, but we're going to use it. So. And it actually has 9 areas of emotional self-regulation. Yeah. And what we're going to do is to try to look at those 9 areas and some other ones which we've thought of to see how well they actually predict happiness, well-being, that sort of stuff. You see. Yeah. So take an idea and test the idea and see how much life it's got in it. Certainly clarity is important. It's part of the language. But if all you can do is describe something but you can't change something, it may actually make you more distressed. Yeah. It's like what often happens in coaching and counselling, where a person walks in and they think they've got this little problem. That's my problem, Yeah. And they walk out thinking actually it's a bit bigger, Yeah. So what we've got to do is you've got to build hope, at least in the same rate as the understanding of the issues. Yeah. And of course, if the problem grows at a faster rate than hope, then they won't come back. They'll feel defeated. They'll feel overwhelmed. Yeah. So it's critical that we encourage people to develop a sense of hope, a positive expectancy that this can be dealt with, the things can be made better. Yeah. So it's about those sorts of things. I pick up an idea. For example, what was it? I came across a book yesterday which was Love for No Reason. No, Happiness for No Reason. Yeah. And I chased it down. It turns out there's a 20-point questionnaire for this. You might like to look it up. And I read through some of those things. Thought, those sorts of interesting ideas. So I classified it into my model, and I pulled out some of those questions, and we're going to incorporate them into our research to see how well, because she identifies 20 things on the basis of interviewing 100 people who are truly happy. Yeah. So I thought, some of those are interesting ideas. Let's test them. Yeah. So it's that sort of thing.
And what would you say is different about coaching where positive psychology is integrated and coaching where positive psychology is not part of it?
I think it'd be really hard to do coaching. Well, it depends on what sort of coaching we're talking about. There's traditional forms of coaching like sports coaching that doesn't take account of it, but should. Well, I think you're missing half the answer, really. Positive psychology is about the science of making the best of who we can be. And if we're only learning half of what the world has to teach us, then it's like trying to walk on one leg. You know, you're not going to get around hopping as well as you will walking or running. So walking on two legs is way better than walking on one.
Yeah.
And the other leg, I think, is positive psychology. So you can do it without, but you probably won't do it very well, and people will think you're a bit odd.
Right. Are there things we've not talked about that are important to understand the way that you work?
There is one thing, I suppose, which is to say, look, this is just the beginning. Whatever happens here in these sessions is just a few hours in your life. For this to really be useful, what it will begin for you is a lifelong process, a lifelong journey. All I'm hoping to do here is to help you make a start in that process. When we finish, whenever that might be, it's just the end of phase one. As long as you live, with any luck, you'll learn and you'll grow and your life will continue to improve. The real measure of this is not how you are at session 8 or conclusion. It's what are you continuing to do to improve and enhance your life. What are you committed to on a daily, weekly basis that will aid your understanding about how to live well?
Yeah.
And that's why we normally end with sort of programs. So I say, okay, so let's think about the year ahead. Let's think about what you can do in this year. It's only one, and hopefully you'll have many more. But let's say you've only got a year. What are you going to do in this year? It's going to improve your life. You know, there are many things that you can do. You can learn in many, many ways. So what's the things you could read? What's the things you could do? But whatever you do, you have to learn from. So let's plan a pattern of commitments and activities. It might just be that you say, in this year, for the rest of this year, I'm going to read 4 books. And the way I'm going to read this book is I give them a handout about how to read a book. That you read a book until you find an answer, until you find something of value, and then you stop and you say, how can I use this in my life?
Yeah.
How can I apply this today? What areas of my life would this improve? What's 3 ways in which I can use this? And then you put the book away, and you come back the next day, and you find another idea. You stop when you get an idea and do the same thing again. Yeah. It's not what you learn; it's what you use.
Yeah.
There's no point learning something if you don't use it. So it's the application. You know, we know that, and the clinical psychology teaches very, very clearly. It's the doing that creates the change.
Yeah.
You know, it's not the thinking. The thinking is a prelude to action. It's the action that locks in the thinking and produces the emotion.
And
so
how can you get people from you help them in a session to get an understanding, and then they have to go do an action or some kind of behavior? How can you kind of get them to?
Well, I use a thing like called the 75% rule, which is that you break things down into small steps, and you shouldn't undertake something unless you feel 75% confident you can do it. If it's 50% or less, you basically expect to fail, and you probably won't want to do it, and you'll look for a way to excuse yourself or avoid it. What we want to is encourage people through success to want to do it. Yeah. Not something they have to do, it's something they desire to do. So they can't wait to get started on this. If you got it right in coaching, people are excited about these exercises because they're self-rewarding, they become intrinsic.
Yeah.
So we set up a set of experiences for people which are intrinsically rewarding for people. And one of the ways to do that is to make sure they mostly succeed.
Right.
So that's the first thing, 75% rule. The other thing, which is important, is we'll always have a conversation in the first or second session about definition of success and failure. And this is really, really important because most people will spend their life trying to get to their objective and may never get there.
Yeah.
And so for the whole life they fail. Most of our life is failure, if we think about it as failure. It's failure if we judge our actions by whether we achieve our outcomes. But there's another way of thinking about it. And so what I suggest to people is anything you do is a success if you've learned something useful from it.
Yeah.
So when you do something, you don't do it necessarily to achieve your objective. That's nice, but mostly it won't happen actually. But what you can do every time is you can learn something useful.
Yeah.
So just do it to learn. And if you do it to learn, you'll love it, and you'll go on doing it, and you'll improve, and you'll get to your objective way faster, and you'll enjoy all the steps in the process.
Yeah.
So thinking about what is success in those terms is really, really helpful, because our job is, we know it from positive psychology, people encouraged by positive results. It's basic reinforcement. We want to make sure that the tasks that they undertake are self-reinforcing. And part of the reason that happens is because we change their evaluative framework, the way they judge and think about their actions and outcomes. And if they think, well, I didn't achieve the things I really hoped for, but I sure learned a lot, and I can see how I can use that, and hopefully things will be better in the future, you feel good.
Right.
And if they feel good, they'll want to use it, and they'll apply it again.
Yeah. And the theory of success and happiness, is that what you've explained? I read on the website that you developed a theory.
Well, it's this that basic idea that there are these four things.
Right.
So one thing that I take exception to, where I think positive psychology is wrong, where the literature is wrong, is if you read Fredrickson's and other stuff, it basically takes the line that happiness precedes success. You'll get that over and over again.
Yeah.
I think it's a half-truth. And it's a half-truth because I think it depends upon how you determine success. I think it's true if you think of success in material terms, in terms of externalities.
Yeah.
It is true that happy people tend to get more in life.
Yeah.
But they get more because they give more, of course. But the half that's wrong is that I think actually success precedes happiness as well. But it's success at meeting our basic needs.
Right.
So what I think is there's a two-step, but it sort of flows around itself. But essentially, we are happy to the extent, because I think happiness is essentially a positive emotion we experience when we feel we are making progress towards the things that are fundamentally important to us.
Yeah.
Which I think are fundamentally those four things. You know, feeling that we're growing, feeling that we are content, feeling we're connected, feeling that we're sort of useful and contributing.
Yeah.
Those things. To the extent that we meet those fundamental needs, then we feel good, and then we're successful in the external things.
Yeah.
So I think success precedes happiness, which then feeds the second stage of happiness.
Right.
And the literature's got it wrong, I think, because they're focusing too narrowly on what success is.
Yeah.
I think happiness does come from success. I mean, if you read, there's some interesting literature recently about the basis of self-esteem. Self-esteem is a very, very powerful predictor. But there's three bases for feeling self-esteem. The first is what you might call virtue, which is around a philosophical idea of human worth.
Yeah.
Which is why religion is in part very attractive to people, because it makes everyone feel valued in and of themselves.
Yeah.
So that philosophical idea is really important. The second is through merit. That is, we feel good about ourselves because we know we're efficacious in the world. We know we're effective. We can do things. And that's a pathway that the society encourages us, but it's dangerous.
Yeah.
Because it says when you can't do anything useful,
yeah,
or you stop doing anything useful, you probably won't feel very good about yourself, because your self-worth is in terms of what you can produce, what you can do.
Yeah.
You know, your productivity.
Yeah.
Whereas the religious view, the philosophical view, says whether you can do things successfully or not, you're still a human being.
Yeah.
You know, you're still worthy of dignity. You still have the same value as every other person in the world. You know, Donald Trump isn't worth any more because he's successful in these sorts of ways. He may feel better because we feel good when we can do things, but he's not worth more as a person merely because he can do that stuff. All humans have the same worth. From the moment of conception, all humans have the same worth. And the third is delusion, or bias.
Right.
Which is what you see in two conditions: narcissism, where people have a almost delusional, distorted view of themselves, or self-deprecation, where people have a very low view of themselves.
Yeah.
So these three pathways to feeling good about ourselves. And if we're going to build self-esteem, then we need to think about each of those things. Delusion is not helpful. Bias is not helpful. All humans will feel good based upon merit, so being successful is good. But that makes us very vulnerable. You end up like the actor whose mood goes up and down according to the reviews. I'm only as good as my last show. I'm only as good as the last review.
Yeah.
No. If people suicide because they feel they're no longer as effective or powerful or efficacious as they were.
Yeah.
There will become a point in all our lives when we can't do much. Should we be sent to the glue factory at that point? Should we be put down? Should we be sent on an ice floe and sent away? No. Whether you can do something or not, you still have the same worth as a human being.
Yeah.
And that discussion around human value, which is what Rogers is talking about, the conditions of positive self-regard, is, I think, really fundamentally important. So I think, in a way, good change, good coaching has its heart in philosophy. It's a philosophy of value. It's a philosophy of meaning.
Yeah.
You know, and that's why I think not all coaches do that very well, because they don't have a clearly worked out philosophy. We need to help people develop a philosophy of life. We did a study a couple of years ago where we were trying to predict happiness. It turned out that I think the second most powerful single item in terms of predicting happiness and well-being was, I have a clearly worked out philosophy of life.
Oh, it's interesting.
Very important. We've just got a paper accepted in the Journal of Happiness Studies, which is where we asked 250 people to write recipes for happiness. And it turned out that having a clear philosophy of life was the third most important contributor.
Okay. That's interesting.
So helping people make sense of their world, which is essentially a philosophical discussion, is what this is. I don't think coaching is about technique. Coaching is about helping people make new meaning, understanding that leads to useful action.
Yeah.
That's the most important thing. So it's a philosophical discussion that we need to have with people. That's why frames of reference, conceptual frameworks, I think are critical to doing that well.
Yeah. Where would I go to learn more about this work that you're doing? Is that your website or?
No, you won't find it on there. You'll just have to sort of wait for us to send you stuff, or I'll send you the papers as they come out, because we're in the process of writing that sort of stuff. We can give you. I've just done one other thing I'm doing. For the last few years, I've been running a program here at the university called Psychologi 101.
Yeah. Some
people hear it as sex, S-E-X. Successology. So don't get too excited. Anyway, it's a simple little program which we've run 5 times now, and it turns out the people who do this program, on average, do 10% better academically for years afterwards. And we've just published a long-term follow-up of that. What I'm in the process of now doing is converting that into a web-based program that all university students will do when they enter university, and it's called Success and Happiness 101. Yeah. Simple little thing. It's got 6 modules. Each module takes just 10 minutes. Just a PowerPoint presentation, very simple. And it gives the model. Basically, it helps people make sense of their world and the transition to university, and about what gives life meaning. And then there's a set of skills about each of these things: how to grow, how to feel content, how to feel connected, and how to contribute. Yeah. And then how to continue. Yeah. And there's a set of application exercises which will take them about 3 to 5 hours. Right. And I'm producing that for the university, but the intention is to run this out for all universities. Okay. So that it's a foundation unit when people come into universities. It's a bit like positive education. Yeah. But the idea is that if you give people a useful framework to think about their life and their action, then they can live better. Yeah. They can do the things that will help them do better. And so that's one of the things I'm involved in. It's about making this stuff really, really simple. Yeah. So that people, ask the question, if you can only do one thing in each of those areas, what would it be? If you could do 3 things, what would it be? Yeah. So in each of those areas, we just teach them a maximum of 3 things, which evidence suggests are the most powerful interventions for each of those things. But then we give them a resource base as well and say, okay, over and above that, there's some other stuff you can do. Right. It doesn't stop here. And so we give them a whole pile of other sorts of resources and stuff. The intention being that hopefully they'll draw on this stuff for life, not just for the couple of weeks that they do it. And would other people from outside university, like in other countries, would they have access to try out some of these interventions? Well, in time, yes. But first we've got to try them here. Right. I'm just in the process of finalising this particular Success and Happiness 101 program. Then we'll evaluate it in the middle of the year, and then we'll roll it out for this university, a partial rollout, so half the students will get it, half won't next year, and then there'll be a full rollout the year afterwards. Right. That way we have a control. Yeah. So we know that it actually makes a difference to people. Right. And what advice would you give to other people
who would be interested in starting to use positive psychology as one leg and coaching as the other?
Knowledge without application, I don't think, is very useful. So my advice to people would be to say, start wherever you are. Every time you find a good idea, stop and then find an application for it.
Yeah.
And don't bother reading anything else until you've used that. Because people forget stuff they don't use.
Yeah.
Reading stuff doesn't change people. Knowing stuff doesn't change people. Using stuff changes people.
Yeah.
So it will be simple. Just find an idea and stop there. And don't read anything else until you've used it.
Right.
And reflected on it and figure that whether there's value and whether or not you can continue using it in that form or some other form, and then go back and find another good idea.
Yeah.
I think life in a way is just collecting good ideas.
Yeah.
You know, all of us go through life, you know, just finding things that are useful and making use of them.
Yeah.
But if all we do is fill our filing cabinets or our head with stuff,
yeah,
and we don't use it,
yeah,
or we just give ourselves a headache.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's using stuff that makes life better.
Yeah. Other types of advice?
Well, the model says that start with yourself first. But even more fundamental than that, the model says that the most important place to learn is to learn to learn.
Yeah.
To recognise that our life improves to the extent that we benefit from the experiences that we have. So learning to learn, I think, is the critical skill in life. And so in a way I'd start there.
Yeah.
Although that's quite hard to be able to do. But thinking about that is important. And, you know, as I say, I think there's those things, you know, basic beliefs, openness. If we're not open, we don't notice, we just don't see. Things happen. So many things happen in front of us that we don't register, we don't notice.
Yeah.
Others see, we don't. We won't benefit from something we don't register. And motivation. What is it that drives us? What's important? What are our values? What are our needs? You know, we need to take action, we need to be proactive, and we need to find pathways.
Yeah.
I'd be inclined to start with those sorts of things. And the very beginning is basic attitudes.
Yeah.
You know, Carol Dweck's work about the idea that you can increase your intelligence just by learning stuff,
yeah,
doing stuff. We rewire our brain every time we use it.
Yeah.
And the cumulative effect of that makes us a different person.
Yeah.
But we have, in the end, our genes don't control us. We turn our genes on and off,
yeah,
by the actions we take, the thoughts we have, the feelings we have. That, you know, these basic ideas about what's possible in this world, I think, are really the starting point here. Because if we don't have that, nothing else happens.
Right. What would you like to know from other people applying positive psychology and coaching? Like, what would be interesting for you to find out?
How to do it better. Well, I mean, we're all ultimately ignorant, and all of us, you know, only have a sort of a partial take on what's happening. So, you know, one of the things that delights me about my life is that I learn new things every day, and, you know, of course it's a bit overwhelming because there's so much, but, you know, so long as you don't beat yourself up over that and think, well, you can, you know, and you have so much time and you can just do what you can do. So, what do I particularly want from other people? Generosity, I suppose. That people share.
Yeah.
We help each other. People contribute. I mean, one of the reasons why contributions in the model is because contribution is important to me. So in some sense it may be a silly model, it may just be my model and it doesn't map onto anybody else's life, you know.
I think it's...
but, you know, I do think that contributing and helping other people is a really important thing. People don't just want to go to their grave and think, well, all I did was I just sort of passed through life and I used a lot of oxygen, I passed out carbon dioxide, you know. But, you know, you don't want that on your headstone.
Mm.
You want someone to say something like, the world's a better place for him having been here.
Yeah.
You know. And so what is that? What is that contribution? What can we do? So generosity, I think, or in Buddhist terms, just kindness.
Yeah, yeah.